and future. A peace that stops the brutal Russian aggression for good, with no opportunities for resurgence. In principle, peace is easy to achieve. Russia needs to stop fighting. Then it's the end of the war. If Ukraine stops fighting, it's the end of Ukraine. Russian aggression against Ukraine began in 2014 with Russia's illegal occupation and annexation of Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine and the launch of direct military intervention in eastern Ukraine. Russia has waged a brutal colonial war aimed at destroying Ukraine's statehood, language, identity, and seizing its resources and territory in violation of the UN Charter and international law. The Baltic states' support of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders is unwavering and unconditional. It reflects our conviction that self-defense of Ukraine is also the defense of our common global security and common future, where might does not make it right. Borders must not be altered by force, and we will never recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, or any other region of Ukraine. And the aggressor has no prerogative to decide which options Ukraine, as sovereign nation, may consider in shaping its future. Ukraine does have right to exercise self-defense, clearly provided for in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Therefore, countries providing aid to Ukraine, including military aid, are not party to the conflict. Mr. President, we emphasize that only Ukraine's victory can ensure lasting security and put an end to Russia's imperialistic aggression. We strongly believe that a rushed ceasefire will not lead to sustainable peace. Instead, it will embolden Russia, and maybe others, encouraging further expansion and putting global security at grave risk. We must defend the principles of the UN Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of further wars. Ukraine has endured unimaginable suffering, as documented in the briefing of USG Carlo. Thousands of lives lost, millions of people displaced, entire cities destroyed to rubble. Permanent damage made to its natural environment, while constant attacks are made on its energy infrastructure. Atrocities endured by the people of Ukraine leave deep scars that will persist for generations. And still, Ukrainians stand strong and resilient, its democracy thriving, parliament working. They are defending their land and values that also uphold the UN Charter and global security. We must remain united and determined in providing long-term support to Ukraine. Global efforts to provide aid, assistance in reconstruction, and supporting displaced populations is a priority. Because this is not an isolated, localized war, nor is it just a European issue. Its consequences are felt across the globe, affecting the food security, energy security in some of the world's most vulnerable regions. According to several estimates, the war that Russia launched against Ukraine has already cost about 2% of the global GDP. 2% of the global GDP. Injustice and impunity in one place embolden efforts to undermine international law elsewhere. So Russia must be held accountable for its aggression against Ukraine. Failure to act will undermine the prospects for a just and lasting peace, not only in Ukraine, but elsewhere. Mr. President, the so-called root causes that we heard today of the wars at Russia's imperial colonial ambitions, that is the root cause. Russia seeks to restore its imperial sphere of influence and change international order. Russia wants to decide the future and choices of sovereign countries and people, not only in Europe, but in other continents as well. We should not let it happen. We call for action by all countries. parliaments, governments, societies to significantly increase assistance to Ukraine. Political, economic, humanitarian, military, all types of assistance, because we must stand with Ukraine in this existential fight, in line with the UN Charter. Then peace, lasting and just peace, could be achieved. I thank you. Slava Ukraini!
感谢布拉泽女士阁下的发言。我现在请芬兰外交国务秘书拉亚拉先生阁下发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. The United Nations was built on the shared understanding that no effort should be spared in pursuit of peace. Yet, today we mark the third anniversary of arguably the most egregious violation of the UN Charter since its adoption, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia's aggression against Ukraine affects us all. It has brought about growing economic instability and soaring food prices in countries far from the battlefields. It has required attention and resources that could have otherwise been used to support people in need elsewhere. Most critically, it has undermined our system of collective security enshrined in the UN Charter. Russia is trying to destroy and dominate a democratic neighboring country and alter borders by using force. Russia attacks international law and the fundamental principles of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states. Therefore, it is existential for us all to uphold these principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Mr. President, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine with its brutal and relentless warfare continues to cause immeasurable human suffering. According to the UNHCR, almost 7 million people have become displaced in Ukraine, and 3.7 million have been forced to flee from their homeland. Russia's systematic attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure deepen the plight of civilians every passing day. Civilians' access to water, electricity, and heating is severely limited amidst freezing winter weather. We are appalled by the treatment of thousands of children who have been unlawfully deported or transferred by Russia. These children must be immediately returned to their families. Russia must comply with its obligations under international humanitarian law, including by ending its attacks against civilian and civilian infrastructure and ensuring humanitarian access. It is untenable that more than 75 years since the adoption of the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war are violated at every turn by Russia. The Nordic countries are committed to seek full accountability for the numerous violations of international law. Russian leadership must be held accountable for the atrocity crimes committed in Ukraine and the crime of aggression. Mr. President, this morning the General Assembly took a decision to support just and fair peace in Ukraine. The Nordic countries are proud to have voted in favor of both of these important resolutions. We know Ukrainians as people who want peace. They wish to go on with their lives and keep on building their beautiful, brave nation. We also know Ukrainians as people who love freedom. The freedom to speak their mind, elect their leaders, and choose their international alliances. It is the duty of this Council to advance both of these goals, that Ukraine can live in peace and uphold its full sovereignty in accordance with the UN Charter. Like all peace-loving nations, Ukraine deserves peace, a peace that is comprehensive, just, and lasting. Ukraine must be part of any negotiation for peace. Russia's aggression against Ukraine undermines not only the security in Europe, but also the stability across the world. Any solution for a lasting peace will necessitate a strong European involvement. Without it, peace runs at high risk of being short-lived. We all have a collective interest to prevent resurgence of violence and destruction in Ukraine as well as anywhere else in the world. Mr. President, the Nordic countries support a search for a just peace. In the meantime, we remain determined to continue our significant military, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. In closing, we reaffirm our unwavering commitment to support Ukraine as long as needed. Thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢拉亚拉先生阁下的发言。我现在请捷克外交部副部长胡利丘斯先生发言。
Mr. President, thank you.
对，
8 years ago, after the Second World War, our wise predecessors enshrined in Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations the very basic principle of peaceful coexistence among nations. They prohibited the use of force by any state against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. And on 24 February 2022, Russia has violated this very fundamental principle of international peace when it launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, escalating a conflict it started with the occupation of Crimea and Donbass in 2014. Since then, it has been shamelessly attempting to steal the territory of a neighboring state through a war of aggression. And for that, Russia must be called to account and not rewarded. For all the victims of the Russian massacres in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, or Borodinka, for all the victims of this unprovoked and unjustifiable war, Kremlin must be held accountable and bear responsibility for the destruction and suffering it deliberately caused in Ukraine. This war is not only about Russia and Ukraine. This concerns us all. The ultimate victory of Ukraine means victory of the rule of law and respect for others, while its defeat would allow lawless brutality to prevail. The consequences would reverberate around the world for many years to come, undermining the very foundations of this organization and security globally. Mr. President, Czechia remains committed to supporting Ukraine's desire for peace. Peace that respects Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Peace that clearly distinguishes between the victim and the aggressor. Peace that is just and lasting. If Russia and its President Putin claims that their wish to end this war is sincere, then there is one simple way to prove it: send Russian soldiers back home. The solution of this war is that simple. Mr. President, my country has its own tragic experience with imperialism and expansionism, also from side of Russia. We therefore feel a strong solidarity with Ukraine and its people, and we will stay side by side with them for as long as it takes, until just peace in line with the UN Charter and agreed by Ukraine, not imposed on it, is restored. Thank you.
感谢胡利丘斯先生的发言。下面我请罗马尼亚外交国务秘书赫里斯泰亚先生阁下发言。
Mr. President, Madam Undersecretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Romania welcomes your decision to have this meeting today and for allowing me to take the floor. And I would like also to join the previous speakers in presenting our gratitude for the report presented by Madam Undersecretary General. While it marks a bleak anniversary, today's session keeps the situation in Ukraine on the Council's agenda. The Council must absolutely remain seized on this matter, since it is this body envisioned as a guarantor of international peace and security and acts on behalf of the United Nations whole membership. Ukraine remains very important for the global community through the complex impact of this war at global level, including the dramatic aggravation of the food insecurity. Romania has demonstrated its solidarity with Ukraine and with the Ukrainian people. We firmly support Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. We have welcomed Ukrainians fleeing the war and granted temporary protection status to over 230,000 people. We have facilitated the transit of over 55 million tons of Ukrainian grains to global markets, and we have provided emergency energy support for Ukraine upon request. Since day one of the start of the war, we have advocated for a just, sustainable, and inclusive peace in Ukraine, based on the United Nations Charter and the international law. Any resolution on Ukraine put on the table at the United Nations should be necessarily based on this idea. Any peace talks must include Ukraine. Since peace in Ukraine impacts European security, any solutions affecting the European security architecture should be drafted with the Europeans at the table. It is obvious that any post-conflict arrangements will have systemic implications for the entire Black Sea region. Considering the importance of ensuring security and freedom of navigation on the Black Sea, and Romania's geographical position, my country is legitimately interested in the parameters of a future peace in Ukraine. For the reasons stated above, Romania has also been advocated for and supporting measures to consolidate the resilience of our neighbor, the Republic of Moldova. Last but not least, a just peace cannot be attained without justice and holding all those responsible accountable. Romania is part of the efforts to establish the best possible international tribunal for sanctioning the aggression committed against Ukraine in violation of a fundamental norm of international law, the prohibition of use of force. Ukraine is therefore entitled to the strongest reply in terms of judicial accountability. This should serve as an example of compliance with the United Nations Charter and discouragement for any such future actions from any other state. Mr. President, there are 3 brief points that I would like to add in conclusion, and they reflect the spirit of the Chinese presidency signature event organized last week on practicing multilateralism. The Council, who according to the Charter acts on our behalf, should precisely act and defend the United Nations Charter because the illegitimate and brutal attack against Ukraine continues 3 years since it has been launched. The Council should act and defend the United Nations Charter because the aggressor, the Russian Federation, is a permanent member of this body. And third, the Council should act and defend the United Nations Charter because this aggression undermines, with every passing day, the rules-based multilateralism, violating the United Nations Charter and the international law, including the international humanitarian law. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Mr. President.
感谢赫里斯泰亚先生的发言。我现在请荷兰乌克兰问题特使斯豪滕女士阁下发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Undersecretary General Di Carlo for her briefing. Mr. President, in the cold light of day, 3 years after Russia's large-scale, unprovoked and illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we face a bleak and harsh reality, in which, if we do not act now, might is right. We cannot have the aggressor impose a deal on the victim, an aggressor who continues to intensify its attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Saturday's large-scale drone attacks do not show an intention by Russia to end this war. We cannot let a blatant violation of the UN Charter, a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, stand. This would create a dangerous precedent for the future, undermining the principles of international law and the sovereignty of all nations. Ukraine needs to be an equal partner in the negotiations, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And as the security of Europe is directly impacted, Europe should be involved too. Only inclusive negotiations can lead to a just and a lasting peace. Mr. President, this war must end, not just for the sake of Ukraine and Europe, but for the sake of the world. Russia's aggression has had devastating and long-lasting consequences for food security, for the environment, and for nuclear security. The Kingdom of the Netherlands calls on all countries that are enabling Russia's aggression to stop providing Moscow with a lifeline to prolong this unjust war. We call on all member states to help find a just, a lasting, and a comprehensive peace for the Ukrainian people, in accordance with the UN Charter. Changing borders by force must not be rewarded. We must uphold the Charter or risk living in a world where might is right. Thank you.
我感谢斯浩腾女士阁下的发言。现在发言名单上没有其他人，现在休会。
We will also continue to support Ukraine in any way possible until a peace deal that brings a just, lasting and comprehensive peace and security to Ukraine and entire Europe is reached. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
President, and thank you, Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, for your remarks. I also welcome the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine. Mr. President, colleagues, at its heart, the Security Council's purpose is to maintain international peace and security, including the peaceful settlement of disputes. That is why it was created. That is why we are all here in this chamber. The mural on the wall behind me depicts the horrors of war. Let it remind us of our collective responsibility, above all else, to put an end to war and conflict. Over the past 11 years, we have had countless meetings in this chamber about the Russia-Ukraine war. Against the backdrop of this mural, Council meetings have confirmed the horrors of this war, the deaths and injuries to civilians and soldiers, the countless displaced persons, including children, the destruction of infrastructure, the danger to nuclear safety. The United States, as President Trump has made clear, is committed to ending this war, and he has been clear that we must reach a lasting peace. Mr. President, we are under no illusions. We recognize it will be challenging to get an agreement, but the time for Russia and Ukraine to make difficult choices and end the fighting is now. The United States has been in close contact with Ukrainian counterparts throughout this conflict, and we will continue to do so. In the past week, we have also opened a direct dialogue with Russia. As Secretary Rubio announced following discussions in Riyadh, the United States and Russia have committed to negotiating toward an end to the conflict that is enduring and acceptable to all of the parties engaged. We call on all other UN member states to join the United States in pushing for a durable peace that will bring stability to Europe and deter further aggression. And we are proud that the Security Council has done just that just now in passing an historic landmark agreement on Ukraine, the first such in 3 years. Mr. President, after years of destruction and suffering, it is time for all of us to commit to ending this war. I thank you.
感谢美国。
I thank the representative of the United States. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I thank Madam DiCarlo for her statement. Over the past 3 years, the Russian Federation has been waging a large-scale aggression against Ukraine. It has been waging an aggression against the sovereign state, Ukraine, which posed no threat, and a part of whose territory it had occupied illegally since 2014. Russia and Russia alone took a decision on 24 February 2022 to violate the Charter of the United Nations and to renege on the principles which we together set after the Second World War, namely the sovereignty of states, independence, and territorial integrity, Russia chose to bring war back to European soil. Over the past 3 years, Russia has been waging a brutal, illegal, unjustifiable aggression against Ukraine with blatant disregard for international humanitarian law. Russia has been carrying out deliberate strikes against Ukrainian civilians, targeting civilian energy infrastructure, using sexual violence as a weapon of war, and carrying out forced transfers and deportations of Ukrainian children. The perpetrators of these war crimes must be tried. For the past 3 years, Russia has been eroding the foundation of international non-proliferation architecture. Russia has acquired drones and ballistic missiles from Iran. It has been procuring weapons, munitions, and ballistic missiles from North Korea in violation of the resolutions of the Security Council. North Korean soldiers have been engaged on the Ukrainian front in support of Russia's war of aggression, and this poses yet another violation. This represents yet another violation of international law. We all frequently voice our support for the ICJ. Let us recall that the court called on Russia on the 16th of March 2022 to halt its military operations. Russia must end its war of aggression against Ukraine. We wish peace, a comprehensive, just, lasting peace, not an agreement imposed under duress on the victim, the Ukrainian authorities, millions of Ukrainian people who have, over the past 3 years, resisting the Russian forces. President, over the past 3 years, Ukraine has been defending itself against the Russian aggression in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. The courage of President Zelensky, the courage of the Ukrainian people inspires admiration and compels us to take action. France will continue to deliver some military and humanitarian support to Ukraine, the support which it needs as long as necessary. And we stand ready to step up these efforts. Ukraine, a sovereign state, must be free to choose its alliances and its destiny. A resolution to the conflict without Ukraine will be dead letter. This will enshrine the principle of might makes right and will lay the groundwork for future wars. Nothing should be Russia's aggression also poses a direct threat to the entire European continent. Europe, whose security is at stake, needs to participate in any negotiations related to a resolution to the conflict. Nothing can be decided on European security without the European people. There will be no peace or security anywhere in the world if the aggressor is rewarded. The peace in Ukraine, to be a lasting peace, needs to be accompanied by robust security assurances and credible security assurances for the Ukrainian people. President Macron has brought together a number of European and international leaders to work on this. We will continue to make headway alongside all stakeholders keen to achieve peace and security in Europe towards that end. Peace in Ukraine, in order to be just, needs to be respectful of the Charter of the United Nations, its purposes and principles, including sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as was recalled yesterday by the Secretary General. This morning, for the 8th and 9th time in 3 years, and 2 times the General Assembly of the United Nations condemned the Russian aggression, calling for the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The General Assembly of the United Nations, a universal body, this morning was a compass for morality, for compassion towards victims, for legality and sovereign equality of states, and stood up in defense of the bedrock of the international order. The Council needs to take note and follow this example and reiterate its support for the Charter. There is no peace. The only way to achieve peace is by respecting the law and the will of the peoples, and the voice of the Ukrainian people must be heard. Thank you.
The 发言，下面请巴拿。
I thank the representative of France. I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you, Mr. President. Panama expresses its gratitude to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General, for her excellent briefing. And we welcome the distinguished authorities who are with us and who honor us with their presence during this meeting. 3 long years have passed since the beginning of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This conflict, which should already have ended, implied a fracture in international peace and security, the effects of which have had not only a regional but also a global impact, compromising food, maritime, and economic security. Panama, faithful to its pacifist tradition, encourages diplomatic and political efforts to reach a peace agreement in Ukraine through a fair and frank dialogue that will allow the parties to recover peace. The damage caused by the already long conflict, the deaths of military personnel, the massacre of civilians, the displacement of populations, the mistreatment of prisoners of war and arbitrary detainees, the multi-billion-dollar cost of financing and the provision of weapons to the parties to the conflict by third parties, the incalculable economic costs to the states parties to the conflict, all of these make the continuation of this conflict unsustainable. It is regrettable that all efforts made to reach agreements to stop the war have been evasive, unsuccessful, and frustrating. It is therefore clear that the priority at this time should be to bring a definitive end to the tragedy without further procrastination. Therefore, Panama identifies with the echo of the clear and forceful message expressed by the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who in his statement issued on February 23rd this year said, in English, "Enough is enough." Mr. President, Panama is a founding member of this organization and for 80 years has defended the principles established in the United Nations Charter, the cornerstone of international law. We therefore promote respect for the United Nations Charter, for international law, and for our own historic reasons. We have always rejected, and we continue to reject, invasion by one state of another, because we believe that these are undue methods for the resolution of conflict. On the contrary, we firmly believe in multilateralism to enforce the rules-based order to prevent armed conflicts and to maintain international peace and security on a lasting manner, always aiming towards a political diplomatic solution to conflict. Panama, Mr. President, decided to look towards the future, and for this reason we supported the efforts of the United States of America in its aim to bring an end to this war with the support of the international community. We hope that the agreements that will be concluded formally to bring an end to the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine will include terms, conditions, commitments, and guarantees that are concretely negotiated with the participation of the parties directly and indirectly involved in the conflict, and will thus agree to eradicate the war and its devastating consequences, so as to achieve a just, complete, and lasting peace for all. Thank you very much.
感谢。
I thank the representative of Panama. I give the floor to the representative of ROK.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to extend my gratitude to USG DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing. Today marks the third anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and the war continues to rage on. The scars left by Russia's aggression are deeply profound. More than 10 million people, 25% of Ukraine's pre-war population, are now displaced, with around 7 million Ukrainian refugees seeking shelter abroad. Ukraine has lost control of about 1/5 of its territory, and much of the nation has been devastated. Its power generation capacity reduced to just 1/3 of pre-war levels. The core tenets of the UN Charter, largely upheld for 80 years since the United Nations founding, have been severely undermined by a permanent member of the Security Council throughout this war. Furthermore, the security dynamics between Europe and the Indo-Pacific have become increasingly intertwined. In light of this grave reality, I would like to share the following key points. First, we believe there are two goals that everyone can agree on. One, this senseless and unlawful war must come to an end as soon as possible. And two, we must strive to uphold the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and international law. Now is the time to gather our wisdom and determination to simultaneously achieve both objectives as much as possible. Second, based on the experience of the 3-year-long Korean War, when full-scale armistice negotiations begin, the intensity of the conflict often escalates and casualties on the battlefields surge. Both sides must exercise the utmost restraint, as this is in no one's interest. All relevant parties should take this into consideration. Third, in the process of ending this brutal war, which has geopolitical and economic repercussions extending across the globe, the supporters of the UN's ideals and the friends of Ukraine must remain united. In doing so, a robust foundation for international cooperation must be established, addressing both post-war security and reconstruction. Mr. President, halting this war is not just a global imperative, but also essential for the security on the Korean Peninsula. The illegal military cooperation between Russia and North Korea, in blatant violation of multiple Security Council resolutions, must end immediately. In the mounting desperation, Moscow has turned to Pyongyang, not only for an astronomical quantity of weapons, but also for manpower. Furthermore, Russia used its veto and dismantled the panel of experts of the DPRK Sanctions Committee in the Security Council last April, enabling it to conceal this illegal partnership. In return, North Korea is reportedly receiving military support involving arms and technological transfers, perhaps including sensitive satellite technologies. But the danger extends beyond such transactions. Now North Korean troops are gaining real battlefield experience in ways that pose a direct threat to the Republic of Korea's security. In conclusion, Mr. President, as a once war-torn nation, the Korean people poignantly understand the painstaking path to peace and recovery. To support Ukraine's humanitarian and reconstruction efforts, the Republic of Korea provided $400 million last year and will continue to contribute $2 billion financial package over the next 4 years. The Republic of Korea people as they overcome the current hardship and rebuild their proud nation. I thank you, Mr. President.
感谢韩国。
I thank the representative of the IOK. Now I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
General DiCarlo for her briefing today. Today marks the third year of President Putin's full-scale invasion forced on the Ukrainian and Russian people in clear breach of the UN Charter. So first of all today, of all days, we pause to remember and honour the victims of this war, those who have lost their lives, their homes, their futures, their limbs, their childhoods, family members and friends. Millions who have been displaced, tens of thousands who've lost their lives. They've lost schools, playgrounds, farms, churches, hospitals, while Russian forces have used rape, torture and execution as weapons of war and put nuclear safety at risk. This is a war that Putin said would take 3 days. 3 years on, Ukrainians have paid a terrible price. And the impact of this war is not limited to Ukraine. Hunger, poverty, and energy insecurity have increased worldwide. So second, as we look forward to peace, let's be clear. no country wants peace more than Ukraine. Ukraine is more than ready for this war to end. But there needs to be a lasting and a just peace, with Ukraine's voice at the heart of any talks. A peace that is not just a pause in fighting, but a peace that leaves Ukraine secure and free from Russian attack. A peace that shows aggression does not pay, and a peace that ends forever Putin's imperialist ambitions. And we have to remember that Putin, by contrast, only wants capitulation. So if Russia is allowed to win, we will live in a world where might is right, where borders can be redrawn by force, where aggressors think they can act with impunity. The consequences for peace and security around the world are dire. So third, then, a lasting peace must come from strength. Strength and courage that Ukraine has shown abundantly in the last 3 years. But that strength and courage needs to be underpinned by robust security agreements from the outset, because Putin has repeatedly shown that he will break a weak deal. He has long denied Ukraine's right to exist as a free state. So the UK, with our European partners and the United States, will work closely together for Ukraine, and Europe will continue to take responsibility for our continent's security. The UK is ready to play a leading role to support Ukraine in its right to self-defense, to support the negotiation and implementation of a peace agreement, a just and lasting peace agreement which protects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, its internationally recognized borders in line with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. We also appreciate the presence of several distinguished ministers, including Ukraine, and that signifies the importance of this session. For 3 years now, the conflict in Ukraine has caused considerable loss of life, widespread devastation, and immense human suffering, as USG DiCarlo also informed us. The consequences of this conflict transcend borders, impacting the region and beyond. The shock to the global economy was particularly severe for the developing countries. Most ominously, if the hostilities continue, there is an ever-present danger of further military and geographical escalation, which poses a clear and significant threat to international peace and security. It was unfortunate and beyond comprehension that in this age, in today's world, even as the military, humanitarian, and economic crisis intensified, the pursuit of peace remained largely absent and elusive. And that is despite the fact that the vast majority of member states, including the developing world, have constantly desired and advocated for a peaceful settlement of this conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. Pakistan believes that all the peoples affected by this tragic conflict deserve a better future, a future free from fear, violence, and destruction. The international community must redouble its efforts to find a comprehensive and lasting solution to this conflict in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter, to which we remain deeply committed and have always called for their universal and non-selective application. We believe the conflict in Ukraine could have been averted through dialogue and diplomacy. It must be brought to an end now through constructive and inclusive diplomacy. It is encouraging that efforts to bring an end to this conflict have gathered wider momentum recently, including the various high-level contacts. Mr. President, Pakistan would welcome any initiative which helps the parties towards a just, peaceful, and durable settlement of this tragic conflict through constructive and inclusive diplomacy, including all parties, and I repeat, all parties, and others concerned in full respect for the UN Charter, international law, and relevant multilateral agreements, and which is responsive to the legitimate national security interests of all sides. It is in that spirit that Pakistan has supported Resolution 2774 that we have just adopted. We hope this resolution, the first by this Council in 3 years, will finally provide a path to peace. The pursuit of peace is a collective responsibility that must transcend geopolitical divides. We hope this Council will shoulder its responsibility and unite behind this objective. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan. Now I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG DiCarlo for her insightful briefing and welcome the participation of the distinguished Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, other ministers and high-level officials in today's meeting. Mr. President, for the past 3 years, 24th of February has represented a dark moment in history with the invasion by Russia of the territory of Ukraine. This action was a violation of the Charter of the United Nations. Regrettably, the Security Council was unable to prevent this invasion, and even after meeting in this chamber 119 times since the war began, has been unable to take action to end it. For its part, Guyana has underscored the suffering caused to the people of Ukraine and the Russian Federation as a result of the invasion. We have outlined the growing humanitarian needs, called for human rights violations to cease, and for the Russian Federation to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. We have also called for respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Above all, we have called for peace, for this war to end through dialogue and diplomacy, premised on the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. We make these calls again today. Today, after 3 years, there is a glimmer of hope. The Security Council has taken action for the first time, laying the foundation for peace. We underscore that a sustainable peace must be a just peace. With this in mind, and against the backdrop of widening humanitarian needs on the ground, the UN General Assembly made in its resolutions adopted this morning. We also call on the parties to abide by the decision just taken by this Council and to bring this conflict to an end. We caution for all conditions to be perfect before commencing the discussion on the terms for peace. At the same time, we underscore that lasting and sustainable peace cannot be achieved at the expense of justice and international law. We urge the parties to commit themselves to achieving a lasting peace based on these tenets. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana stands ready to work with all members of the Council and the wider international community to bring the war in Ukraine to a peaceful end and to find a sustainable solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, please allow me to thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her valuable briefing. Mr. President, since the beginning of our term in office, we have repeatedly called We have repeatedly indicated that escalation is not futile and will not deliver peace to any party. We have also repeatedly indicated that polarization will only foment tension and lift us apart from the prospects of peace in the region. Accordingly, on this occasion, we reiterate the following points. Firstly, the time has come to exert required diplomatic efforts in order to ease tension between the two parties so that we can, as soon as possible, bring an end to human losses and to the suffering of people. As we have repeatedly indicated, time has proven that the logic of confrontation and force will not resolve the conflict. In the period to come, let us give diplomacy a genuine chance. Secondly, we call again on concerned parties to renounce the logic of escalation and to engage in a comprehensive and constructive dialogue in good faith. Such dialogue must give priority to the security and safety of the peoples of the region. It must seek to achieve a fair and lasting peaceful settlement of the conflict, a settlement that will lead to a solution, one that is based on the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, one that takes into consideration the legitimate security concerns of both parties. In this context, we note with appreciation the due dynamics we have recently seen in order to initiate a political dialogue to resolve the war. Thirdly, the international community must step up its diplomatic efforts in order to bring parties closer and in order to secure a comprehensive political process to resolve the crisis with genuine political will, with diplomacy and constructive and comprehensive dialogue, we can achieve concrete progress and we can find a solution that's acceptable to both parties. Algeria, whether as member of the Security Council or through its bilateral and multilateral diplomatic activities, will continue to support any efforts in order to end the plight of the peoples of the region and to bring this war to an end in a peaceful and sustainable manner. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria. Now I give the floor to representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Under-Secretary General Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for a comprehensive briefing. Sierra Leone welcomes the participation of the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in this important meeting. At this critical juncture in the devastating conflict, Sierra Leone reiterates its urgent call for good faith diplomatic efforts by both the Russian Federation and Ukraine to resolve the conflict. This must include the immediate cessation of hostilities, the implementation of a ceasefire, the full withdrawal of all forces, and unwavering support for the rights, dignity, and future well-being of civilians. The human cost of this conflict are tragic. Since February 2022, approximately 41,000 women and children have been killed or injured. Widespread destruction has decimated essential civilian infrastructure, including homes, schools, hospitals, markets, and water and energy facilities. An estimated 12.7 million people in Ukraine are in desperate need of food, clean water, shelter, and heat during the winter, with most of them having lost their loved ones and livelihoods. The risks to lives remain alarmingly high, compounded by reports of unexploded ordnance covering approximately
30% of Ukrainian territory. In response to this dire situation, we earlier voted in favor of Resolution 2774, draft resolution proposed by the United States. Although we had concerns about the process and the potential for the instrumentalization of the UN and this Council, our vote in favor reflects our belief that Ukraine must be at the forefront of any peace process or agreement, in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter, and that the legitimate concerns of all parties must be addressed. Through our vote, and since the onset of the conflict, we have spoken with clarity to affirm the UN Charter principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-use of force, as well as the peaceful settlement of disputes. These are not mere aspirations, but they are the legal and moral foundations upon which our collective security rests. Any erosion of these principles threatens not only Ukraine in this context, but also every member state, particularly smaller nations whose security depends on adherence to international law. As an elected member of this Council, Sierra Leone reaffirms its commitment to upholding the principles of the UN Charter and supporting all efforts towards a just, sustainable, and comprehensive peace. This conflict must not be allowed to persist into a fourth year. The path forward must be one of peace, through diplomacy. The scale of suffering caused by this conflict compels this Council to explore every possible avenue to not only direct our efforts towards the path of peace, but implement Resolution 2774, and also ensure that millions of civilians can safely return to their homes, rebuild their lives and their communities. Noting the urgent need for an immediate cessation of hostilities and lasting peace, Sierra Leone underscores the following 3 points. First, efforts to achieve peace must involve the good faith participation of all relevant stakeholders, including both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Only with such engagement can we reach a viable and legitimate political solution. We acknowledge the ongoing efforts of member states in this regard and emphasize the importance of aligning political and diplomatic actions towards this end. Due consideration must be given to the active roles of the external actors in supporting the peace process and its outcome, including the provision of any peace agreement. Given the critical role of regional efforts in addressing conflicts of this nature, Sierra Leone believes that any initiative to end the conflict in Ukraine must include the involvement of key European partners, whose positions are integral to securing the long-term stability of the region. We also encourage constructive engagement with international partners who have contributed positively to actions such as prisoner of war exchanges and efforts towards de-escalation. Moreover, we stress the importance of ensuring that women and youth are given a meaningful role in decision-making concerning reconstruction and recovery efforts in both Russia and Ukraine. Mr. President, I now turn to my second and most crucial point: the integral role of the Council in establishing legitimate guarantees for lasting peace. Given the history of challenges surrounding territorial and sovereignty issues, as well as security concerns in this conflict, the Security Council must play a pivotal role in safeguarding any peace agreement. This requires clear actions and objectives to be implemented in phases, particularly concerning national military capacities and armaments, regional security arrangements, bilateral defense cooperation, and the recognition of fixed borders. The Security Council must legitimize and support practical actions and compromises that are consistent with the principles of the UN Charter and guided by the decisions of the General Assembly and previous resolutions of the Council, including General Assembly Resolution, Security Council Resolution 2625, 2417, and 2573, which emphasize the protection of civilian lives and infrastructure. In promoting lasting peace, the Security Council should also utilize its mechanisms to monitor and enforce ceasefires and other outcomes. Third, the peace process must address the humanitarian crisis caused by this conflict, prioritizing the swift resolution of its most urgent aspects. An immediate cessation of hostilities is necessary to ensure the full protection of civilians, allowing them to live safely in their homes, attend school, and access markets and hospitals without fear of being killed or injured by attacks. The conflicting parties must cease their attacks on critical civilian infrastructure, especially energy infrastructure, which pose risks to regional and global security. Humanitarian aid must be allowed unhindered access across Ukraine and Russia, including to those in isolated or hard-to-reach areas. Furthermore, children forcibly removed or abducted from their homes in Ukraine must be returned to their families and communities. We also emphasize the importance of adherence to international law, particularly international humanitarian law, in the treatment of prisoners of war and civilian detainees. Sierra Leone commends the successful exchanges of POWs in the past and urged the release of all POWs and civilian detainees. We fully support calls for prompt, impartial, and effective investigations into all alleged violations of international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, especially those that result in excessive harm to civilians. In conclusion, Mr. President, we call on the parties to this conflict to do all they can to reach a peaceful resolution. They must seek practical compromises that balance their immediate and long-term national interests and priorities in line with Article 33 of the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone. Now I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin by thanking USG DiCarlo for her briefing and welcome the representative of the region to this meeting. My delegation voted in favor of the draft resolution, The Path to Peace, and extends its appreciation to the United States for tabling this important initiative. We commend this timely effort to address the ongoing conflict between Russian Federation and Ukraine. As the international community observes with deep concern the third anniversary of the situation in Ukraine, my delegation wishes to express its profound solidarity with those affected by the ongoing crisis. The present circumstances underscore the paramount importance of the collective diplomatic engagement. Mr. President, my delegation expresses its profound concern regarding the devastating humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Ukraine. The relentless conflict continues to exert an unbearable toll on civilian populations, destroying homes, separating families, and shattering communities. We witness with great distress the ongoing displacement of civilians, the destruction of critical infrastructure, and the severe disruption to essential services that sustain civilian life. The humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate, leaving an indelible mark on generations of civilians who bear the brunt of this crisis. In this context, my delegation calls upon all concerned parties to uphold their obligation under international humanitarian law, with particular emphasis on the protection of civilian and civilian infrastructure, the facilitation of unimpeded humanitarian access, remains of paramount importance. My delegation maintains the firm conviction that there can be no military solution to the present situation. A resolution can only be achieved through diplomatic means. In this regard, we call for the cessation of hostilities and the pursuit of dialogue addressing the concerns of all parties in accordance with established international principles. Drawing from our national experience, my delegation fully appreciates the complexities inherent in achieving peace and reconciliation through diplomatic channels. We encourage all parties to demonstrate the necessary political will to engage in meaningful dialogue. My delegation notes with interest the diplomatic engagement that took place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, between the delegations of the United States and the Russian Federation regarding the situation in Ukraine, and support all diplomatic initiatives that may contribute to de-escalation, dialogue, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Mr. President, my delegation wishes to echo the Secretary General's appeals regarding the cessation of hostilities. We reaffirm the fundamental importance of a strict adherence to the purposes and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, particularly regarding the peaceful settlement of disputes and the respect for territorial integrity. Somalia remains steadfastly committed to working towards the pursuit of a peaceful resolution. It's through our collective diplomatic endeavors that we may achieve the shared objectives of establishing just and lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Somalia. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, today we once again see in this chamber under Rule 37 a significant dissonance in the group of support for Ukraine in Europe, comprised of so-called ministers from so-called foreign affairs, names which I do not have time to remember even. And frankly speaking, Mr. President, I'm not even trying to. We are just pleased at the consistency of other colleagues. We remember with Thank You USA, with the sabotage targeting Nord Stream pipelines. Today, these ministers are reading out their templates and their cookie-cutter statements and in front of the cameras, and they are announcing their unstinting support for Ukraine. You should sweep up in front of your own home. You should clean up your own prosperous garden. The geopolitical hurricane which we see taking place. Mr. President, we view today's meeting as an open attempt to thwart the positive progress that has been made, which will soon help to result in a long-term, complete and lasting settlement to the Ukrainian crisis. We have received yet another opportunity to see that the Kiev regime and its sponsors in European capitals are interested not in peace, but rather in pursuing war until the last Ukrainian. And the results of the recent U.S.-Russian contacts at the senior and senior-most levels have generated momentum. And it is of equal importance that recently, thanks to the new positive policy of the Trump administration, the details are unfolding about what actually took place and continues to take place under the Zelensky regime. These details are surfacing now. We think that it is far clearer now to many also why the Ukrainian crisis 3 years ago transformed into the armed conflict, despite the protracted years-long persistent efforts by the Russian Federation to prevent this. The world sees that the entire anti-Russian project of Ukraine, as we repeatedly stated here in this chamber, from the very beginning was financed by the West. And this unfortunate situation of the operations of USAID. 3% of the Ukrainian GDP, equal 3% of the Ukrainian GDP. Ukraine independently did not exist and does not exist in that way. The agency paid for the activities of the Ukrainian state apparatus and prepared and trained Ukrainian judges and exerted direct influence on the Ukrainian judiciary. Given the U.S. financing, the Ukrainian parliament took lessons. $25 million were allocated by USAID for public events and work of the Secretariat of the Parliamentary Commission. And this we see the manifestation of Ukrainian незалежність, or rather independence, as they say. And we understand the real value of freedom of speech in Ukraine, as it transpired. Up to 90% of Ukrainian media outlets were financed by USAID, and through it, approximately $50 million were spent for so-called public opinion leaders to make an appearance on the social networks. Tens of millions of dollars were paid to U.S. celebrities who traveled to Ukraine and who spoke out in support of the Ukrainian regime. For this reason, all of this picture, which compelled everybody to believe in the universal popularity of the erstwhile comic, turned out to be a lie. And at the same time, shaping Ukraine's political landscape is something that USA began to do long before 3 years ago. More than $100,000 were allocated for financing a television show, which helped to facilitate Zelensky's election victory in 2019. And immediately after this, the organizations financed by the agency prohibited Zelensky from supporting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, from conducting referenda into the format of negotiations with Donbass and the principles for the peace settlement, and reviewing the language law, rehabilitating and returning politicians of the Yanukovych era, restoring access to Russian television. Being aware of all of this, we are not surprised why Zelensky, who was elected with 3/4 of the vote, immediately abandoned his promises when it came to the East, abandoned promises for the defense of the Russian language and establishing relations in Russia, and those who purchased him simply prohibited him from doing so. Mr. President, we wish in this context to draw colleagues' attention to one aspect of how USAID shamelessly shaped the political landscape in Kiev. Last week, a U.S. representative pointed to Justice Department participation in the so-called Raskolnik Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The schismatic Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and this was done in a very cynical way with no concern whatsoever for any democratic values. And these recognitions yet again demonstrated how the efforts of unprincipled officials for Ukraine were shaped to wage war against a political opponent. And a significant role in this was played, as it became clear, was played by the then head of CIA and the special advisor on freedom of faith, who not only turned a blind eye to egregious violations of the rights of believers and arrests of clergy and the seizure of churches in Ukraine, but they did everything possible to encourage these travesties. Furthermore, those in Washington turned to the Middle East and North Africa, compelling local Orthodox churches to recognize the illegitimate, non-canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now we understand perfectly well that the funds of Biden's diplomacy were used for, including blackmail, pressure, extortion, and the list goes on, obsessed with the desire to destroy the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church and destroy the unity of Orthodox followers in Ukraine and Russia. They had no concern about the fact that their actions undermined freedom of speech in Ukraine. As you all remember, we repeatedly in this chamber drew the attention of the Council to the situation around the repressions against the Ukrainian Orthodoxy in Ukraine. In response, we heard merely old propaganda and mantras. And will you repeat them once again here, or can you summon the courage to at least voice concern about this information? And we welcome the fact that the Trump administration has taken power allowed those
experts who were stripped of opportunities to speak out, now they can speak out because their assessments of the situation in Ukraine, including religious ones, ran counter to the Western views. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, publicly condemned the persecution of the church, and a number of Republicans in Congress demanded that an investigation began into intervention of American structures in religion in Ukraine. We believe that this is very important, albeit belated turn of events. Mr. President, the former patron of the White House and Ukrainian proteges, they were able to get away with everything, even the murders of Ukrainian citizens. Last week, thanks to former deputy of the Rada, Mr. Dubinsky, who was held, as we know, under detention, new details emerged about the deaths and torture chambers of the Ukrainian regime of the independent U.S. journalist Gonzalo Lira. In our statements, once again, we repeatedly drew attention of colleagues of the Security Council to his tragic death and highlighted the need to ensure that the Kiev regime respects human rights and fundamental freedoms, all in vain. This fell on death. You had no regard for the fate of this individual and tens of thousands of other political prisoners in Ukraine. And at that point, they could have been saved had the Biden administration done something at least to do so. As we can see from the correspondence of the late U.S. blogger Dubinsky, the security forces of Ukraine not only tortured the person, but they stole money from him while he was in detention after the receipt of $7,000 from them. The torture and the assaults only were heightened. The Ukrainian Registry of Judicial Decisions has decisions of the Jazinski Regional Court in Kharkov, dating January 2024, during a meeting of which Mr. Lira's lawyer requested that he brought under house arrest for medical reasons, but the Office of the Prosecutor, representatives of Ukrainian forces, and the others continued to claim that his life was not under threat. And literally weeks later, he perished because timely medical assistance was not provided to him as a result of the trauma and the beatings that he endured. All the documents attesting to this is in existence. They exist. Distinguished colleagues, I wish to emphasize the following. Gonzalo Lira's life was related to criticism related to the Zelensky regime and Biden. This is objective material, and this is precisely why he was tormented to death following the orders of Zelensky. No Western officials, including from the United States, at that point said anything whatsoever about this. They were unable to summon the courage not just to condemn this latest crime by the Kiev regime, but even to somehow to comment what took place. Western politicians, like our Western colleagues at the Security Council, simply made it appear as if nothing happened, and they redoubled their efforts to continue to accuse Russia of aggression and to continue to state that their support for the Kiev regime was unstinting. Otherwise, the death of a U.S. citizen was viewed by Biden as collateral damage, and the Ukrainian citizens who are in opposition to Zelensky, there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of them. And during the last meeting, we already talked about how in 2021, Ukrainian forces tortured Artyom Detruka, a Rada deputy, trying to have some evidence from him and testimony about treason. We call on those who continue to defend the Zelensky regime to recognize that the concentration camp, the Ukrainian torture chambers, where inconvenient people were tortured and then murdered, this is not fabrications of Russian propaganda. This is the reality that embodies present-day Ukraine. Unfortunately, Gonzalo Lira is someone who we cannot help, but we can help to release all of those who, under trumped-up pretext, continue to be held by the Ukrainian clique. We call upon all conscientious governments, international structures, to condemn the criminal actions of Zelensky and to demand the release of all of those who remain alive and who can still fight for freedom. Elena Berezhnaya comes to mind, and her case speaks volumes. demand the release of Lilena and many others who are enduring illegal persecution and torture is something which is our duty. If you fail to understand this and you're willing under political considerations to turn a blind eye to the crimes perpetrated by the Kiev regime, then your disregard for the freedom of human rights and freedom of speech are merely dead letter. And you in all other situations, barring none, you prioritize statements related to this. President, in statements here, once again, we drew attention to the blatant corruption in Ukraine, which seeped into all of society under Ukraine. We pointed to the glorification of those who are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, Roma, and Ukrainians during the Second World War. We provided information about mass human rights violations. We highlighted examples of the blatant looting of Western assistance, the resale on the black market of weapons from the U.S. and Europe. We pointed to the illegitimacy of the Ukrainian head who trampled upon the constitution of the country in order to cling to power. Today, senior U.S. politicians can describe this and read Western media outlets. Of course, this is heartening. There are growing opportunities that an individual who provoked the Ukrainian crisis transformation into a hot phase, who trampled upon basic Ukrainian freedoms, who betrayed the interests of the country, who abandoned and rejected the realistic solution for the resolution to the conflict, and who seeped his country in blood for clinging to power and for his own profit. There's hope that he will be duly punished. And the Western sponsors of the Ukrainian regime, let them continue to shield him. Let them continue to pin all blame for the Ukrainian crisis on Russia, pinning all conceived and all possible crimes on them without considering everything that the Kiev regime has been doing as it has been seeking to provide cover for its bankrupt client. As we saw in today's vote in this chamber on the U.S. draft resolution, it is becoming increasingly difficult for them to cover this up because the facts speak for themselves, and these inconvenient facts, inconvenient for the Ukrainian regime and its puppeteers, are becoming increasingly prevalent. We call upon those in Europe who continue to maintain common sense, who can summon the courage to disassociate themselves from the crimes of Zelensky, to do this as soon as possible before it, as Polish President Andrzej Duda prophetically said, before it drags down everybody who supports them into the abyss. Thank you.
I
thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Mariana Betsa, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Chinese presidency for convening this meeting. I'm also grateful for Under-Secretary General DiCarlo for her briefing. At the outset, I would like to express our profound gratitude to all UN member states that just hours ago supported the relevant UN General Assembly resolution and demanded on the 3rd anniversary of full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation of Ukraine swift achieving of comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine consistent with the UN Charter. At the same time, we cannot say the same regarding the UN Security Council resolution. In our view, this document lacks basics. It lacks the qualification of the war as an aggressor of one member state against another member state. It also doesn't reflect the core principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Mr. President, 3 years ago, Russia started a full-scale invasion against Ukraine. 3 years of Ukraine's fight for freedom, for our independence, but also for the freedom of the entire democratic world. Today, more than 600,000 Russian troops are deployed on our territory, 3 times the number that invaded in 2022. Despite all odds, Ukraine's defense forces continue to stand firm, even as the disparity in military strength remains stark. This disparity exists because since regaining independence in 1991, Ukraine has consistently pursued disarmament, reducing the vast military arsenals inherited from the Soviet era, We took seriously the provisions of the UN Charter, setting peace-loving as a fundamental criterion for membership in this organization. We envisaged our region as an era of peace and prosperity. Without hesitation, we choose to become a non-nuclear state. We gave up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal in the hope of making the world a safer place. And while we do not regret the moral righteousness of this decision, we have learned a very harsh lesson from the Budapest Memorandum. A deal without viable and effective security guarantees is a bad deal. Meanwhile, Russia did the opposite, not only preserving Soviet-era stockpiles, but significantly expanding them. Today, as a result, Russia is capable of striking Ukrainian frontline positions and residential areas with thousands of guided aerial bombs every month. In 2024 alone, Russian aviation has launched 40,000 such bombs. Just imagine this figure on peaceful Ukrainian cities, on peaceful Ukrainian civilians. Moreover, Russia continues to escalate its weapons production, including ballistic and cruise missiles. Each month, Russia is capable of producing 40-50 Iskander missiles, 30-50 Kalibr missiles, and around 50 Kh-101 missiles. And these weapons do not just stay in stockpiles. They immediately deployed against Ukraine. But even this has not been enough for Moscow. That's why Russia engaged Iran and DPRK in its war against my country, thus making this conflict internationalized. What started as arms supplies has escalated further, with North Korean military units appearing in Europe and fighting against a European nation. And I'm glad to note that today's UNGA resolution adopted is having a reference to the DPRK involvement in this terrible war. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russia has suffered staggering losses: hundreds of thousands of soldiers, over 10,000 tanks and 22,000 artillery systems, 370 aircraft, and more than 12,000 multiple launch rocket systems. The Black Sea Fleet has lost 28 vessels, including its flagship. What remains of it is now forced to seek refuge, not even in the occupied ports of Crimea, but in the Russian ports itself. These outcomes are the result of two factors: the resilience of the Ukrainian people and the solidarity and support of the international partners. We feel this support and we are very much grateful for it. Russia attacks both of these pillars because, despite all of its advantage, it has failed to break Ukraine on the battlefield. It tries to crush our spirit, primarily through terror. That is why it targets critical infrastructure and residential buildings. That is why Russian soldiers are executing Ukrainian prisoners of war en masse. These execution-style killings must be investigated thoroughly by international organizations, and all those responsible must be brought to justice. Russia seeks to undermine global security with Ukraine, solidarity with Ukraine. Its vast propaganda machine spreads aggressive disinformation, attempting to discredit our country and sow doubt about Ukraine's ability to preserve its independence. Now Russia is pushing an entirely unworkable principle, negotiating about Ukraine without Ukraine, and packaging its harmful narratives in an appealing guise to this end. And let me be clear on behalf of Ukraine that there is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and there is nothing about Europe without Europe. Let me assure you that Ukraine wants peace more than anyone, but not any peace. As our President Volodymyr Zelensky stated, we need comprehensive, just and lasting peace with clear security guarantees. Otherwise, it will not work. To achieve this, we must intensify diplomatic efforts to establish a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the principles of the UN Charter. It is in the interest of its entire humanity to secure such a peace this year. What Russia needs is not a peace, but a temporary pause in hostilities. Such pause would not bring peace. It would simply serve as a prelude to a larger war. Moscow needs time to replenish its losses, learn from its mistakes, and fine-tune its military economy. For 3 years, Ukraine has been saving time for others by withstanding the Kremlin's war machine. Our efforts and sacrifices must not be in vain. For that to happen, alliances built on shared values must be strengthened, not undermined. NATO and EU are indispensable elements of regional security, and Ukraine is eager to be part of them, not only as a security recipient, but as a security provider. And the Security Council, which bears the primary responsibility for maintaining peace and security, must live up to its mandate. Those responsible for the crime of aggression must not enjoy impunity. Sovereignty and territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders must be respected by all. We will continue to defend ourselves and strive for a fair and just peace consistent with the UN Charter. We know how to contain Russia, and our military has mastered the art of modern technological warfare. But however we need to sustain this fight, we need more help from you. We need arms, air defense, technology, investment, tougher sanctions on Russia, and transfer of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, and of course, political and moral backing. We must be mindful of the fact that this is existential war. This is existential war for the entire democratic world, for our democratic principles and values. And Russia has repeatedly tried to dismantle this rules-based order and our security architecture. It is impossible to stop the aggressor by appeasing. Appeasement doesn't work. Russia must implement the demands by the international community and withdraw its troops from the territory of Ukraine. Those responsible for the crime of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity must be brought to justice. We remain committed to the establishment of the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against the Russian Federation. And let me reiterate once again, this war is existential. Humanity must be brought to justice. We remain committed to the establishment of the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against the Russian Federation. And let me reiterate once again, about entire democratic world. Thank you so much.
感谢别莎女士阁下的发言。
for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency.
先生发言。
President, colleagues, I address you today not just as the Foreign Minister of the democratically elected government of Poland, but also on behalf of the High Representative of the European Union, Kaja Kallas, to present the view of the European Union on Russia's illegal and unprovoked war against Ukraine. As has already been said, no one wants and needs peace in Ukraine more than the Ukrainians. No one has a larger stake in European security than us Europeans. And no one has greater power to end this conflict than Russia. All she needs to do is stop the killing and leave territories she illegally occupies. Only with these facts in mind can we work to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine, consistent with the UN Charter. On this tragic anniversary, our thoughts go out to the countless Ukrainians who have suffered. Their resilience is a testament to the unbreakable spirit of people who seek nothing more than their rightful place in the community of free nations. We must never forget the crimes committed by Russian troops in Borodyanka, Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, and so many other places across Ukraine. The perpetrators must be held accountable. We should also acknowledge the far-reaching repercussions beyond Ukraine's borders. Russia's war has disrupted global food and energy markets. It has affected countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, thousands of kilometers away from Ukraine. And the people of Russia too. The Russian government has spent at least $200 billion of their taxpayers' money on this war. It will likely cost Russia over $1 trillion in previously anticipated economic growth by the end of next year. Imagine how many kindergartens, schools, and hospitals could be built for Russians, or for that matter, for countless other people around the world with such a fortune. But instead of building them, the Kremlin prefers to bomb them in Ukraine, while treating Ukrainians and its own people as collateral damage. As of this January, about 170,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. 600,000 more have been wounded. Russia's enablers must also be called out. The People's Republic of Korea is not only providing Muscovy with weapons, but also with troops. Iran is sharing its Shahed drones. Colleagues, the right way forward remains. Russia should immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its forces from Ukraine's territory. We as Europeans will continue to stand side by side with Ukraine to achieve a just and lasting peace. Peace through strength, the only kind Kremlin respects. Finally, I'd like to dedicate to this Council a maxim authored by my predecessor as Foreign Minister of Poland, a survivor of Auschwitz and of Stalinist prisons, Professor Władysław Bartoszewski. When you are in doubt how to behave, behave with decency. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
我感谢齐克尔斯基先生阁下的发言。下面我请拉脱维亚外交部长布拉泽女士阁下发言。
Her Excellency Ms. Braza, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Latvia.
Mr. President, I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. I thank the Presidency of the Council for convening this meeting, and I thank the Undersecretary General, Ms. De Carlo, for her comprehensive briefing detailing Russia's attacks and crimes in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Today marks 3 years since Russia launched a full-scale
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。